Isn't that funny? It's funny, isn't it?
It's been many videos since I first said this and I refuse to stop now, but to me the late 90s anime classics all embody specific feelings exceptionally well. Depression with Evangelion, loneliness in Bebop, Trigun and Hope, or Lain and Connection. I think Serial Experiments Lain can also be forced into this pattern my brain has determined and now refuses to let go of, because at its core the series is about connection, with that topic then being embodied on many levels, the physical versus the abstract and the personal versus the social. Really, I think there's one question at the heart of it all, which is who am I? An issue of connection with oneself. Then if there's an issue with who you are, can you be certain of who others are, how you connect to them? The question gains length along the line where it lies. Introduce a brand new world which exists parallel to theirs in the wired, and the question then gains dimension along another axis. Who am I here and who am I there? This is why I say it's really all about connection, and that it can be, albeit roughly, summed up best in that one word. With this in mind, it stands to reason the success of the series depends heavily on making the viewer believe there is an issue within connection within the anime, which serves to drive Lain to ponder such questions, which are then left open by design for us to ponder ourselves. Actually, quite famously so, the production team for Lain is quite clear in their interviews that there isn't one meaning for the series. It was purposely made to be confusing and abstract, allowing anyone and everyone to claim their own meaning. But anyway, getting back on track, I think the constant discussion around the series, which has been confusing and delighting fans for 20 plus years now, proves that the team really did accomplish this goal, which means they also established an idea in the viewer's mind that Lain's world was one with issues of connection. So today, let's take some time and look at and listen to the anime in physicality, not attempting to state a meaning I gleaned from the series, but instead how they made it something which could be so meaningful in the first place. This won't be a philosophical discussion like normal, but a technical one, praising the anime's standout charm, design, and world building, which all led it to be one of the era's all-time classics. Naturally, my first note on the series starts with the time code 0 minutes and 0 seconds, because from that initial moment the anime is laying the groundwork for a lack of connection. Quite literally, the first image we see is that of a hardly functioning signal, a fuzzy image that prevents us just a vague form. We can tell something is trying to be communicated to us, but nothing more, no specifics of what it is. And then it breaks and we're whisked off to one of the all-time greatest openings in the anime, which also led me to one of my all-time favorite albums in Boa's Twilight, the album Duvet was picked from. But back on track again, I think these first few seconds are important because they essentially dictate to us the anime's guiding principle, a weak, hazy connection that's struggling to communicate even the most basic information, in addition to letting you know what the anime's aesthetic choices will be right off the bat. Then, after the OP, we get this same principle reinforced to a more broad degree. The start was one signal. Here we get a view of the world itself, and it's nothing really. It's people walking somewhere in the city, cars trying to get through, the walk signs changing, but there's nothing nondescript. It's populated but feels devoid of anything real. Once again, it's images that convey no information, just signs of life existing and nothing more. There's a world here, but what is it and why is it? The first signs of life we see are Chisa's, which is about to end. She's having a seeming panic attack and gets laughed at for it. And then following her moment of silence on the rooftop is the loud crashing and banging of a body falling to the ground below. And I think what follows is where things really start to be telling. The immediate reactions all grow concerned with themselves. It changes from "this is horrible" and "what's going on" to "I had nothing to do with this," heard over the backdrop of this drunk pair. And just as he started to force himself on her, they're interrupted by Chisa, but have no reaction to it. They simply stand and stare in this odd way. I think this transitions the opening intentional vagueness into something more concrete, a sort of forceful hedonism which permeates through the series. These girls laugh because it gives them an immediate pleasure and the feeling of superiority. These passerbys distance themselves from a gruesome death so they can move on with their day and keep chasing pleasure, and this pair is an obvious mismatch who don't even comprehend what's happening here. It's not just a coincidental lack of connection here, but a convenient one. Asking someone what's wrong and building a connection is less gratifying than pointing and laughing is easier than holding a real conversation. this man is pushing himself on this woman because it's convenient. He's seeking pleasure, he's probably bought some drinks, maybe taking that as the monetary act, which is the requirement for such an arrangement in some messed up thought process, and now he's taking what he wants. There isn't a connection here, nowhere in this world, and right here specifically, it's just two people who are fulfilling a role someone else wanted them to. And this is far from the only case of such behavior in the anime. Later, as Lain returns to Siberia, she passes by this interaction.
Come on, why not? Why not?
It's more of the same, just a different crowd in a different place. All of these moments are some of my favorite seemingly random notes of the anime, how adult and sexual many things are without mention. I think it's very intentional to express this lustful feeling where it's not about building a connection, but simply gaining pleasure. We even see a version of this later with her sister Mika. Episode 5 is the most we see of her character, and it's led off by her remaining completely silent as the guy she presumably spent the night with makes a vague attempt at breakfast or another outing. But she's not interested, and he doesn't really care that she isn't, given he just goes back to sleep. And here we find the kind of evolution of this principle, a false connection, but one more between hedonism and some sort of bland utilitarian farce. There's an act of pleasure, one agreed upon, one with a bit more effort than just fulfilling a role, but really to no end. It's simply a bit of theater put around the action. They each got what they wanted, and then they each move on. And then on the street outside, she witnesses this nondescript scene, responding to it with,
Damn, I can't believe it.
There's nothing definitive here, but we can guess at the situation. The pairs of women look close, their poses like couples would be, but their backs are to the wall and they're closed in by these two men, although everything looks friendly enough. Is it a pair of lesbian couples being approached by some skeevy guys, a group of friends who are just close, or maybe they're pretending to get out of an awkward situation? Let's look at it as the first situation. Mika, after just leaving her connectionless morning, sees some genuine connections being intruded upon, meaning the guys who could be out there building connections with other people are instead intruding on others, and she's left with nothing either way. It seems like it would be hard to believe sitting there and watching, right? And it's taken another step further when someone does finally approach her, but it's Taro playing adult. He's like an outright parody, some rejected character from an old sitcom who takes a swing at everything he sees. It's a bit of theater poking fun at connection, like everything he's witnessed as someone living in this world has taught him that that's how connection started, with some cheesy lines and a cool guy attitude. In short, it's all an act. That's what a child of this world knows of connection. And then we find the other end of the spectrum completed as we see the full utility side of things in her parents. Lain's mother and father are two of the oddest characters in the anime, which stand as the most blunt examples of a lack of connection. What I really love is that mechanical is genuinely an apt description of their, in heavy quotes, romance. I mean, Mika literally watches as they play out their roles in silence, passing back and forth the predefined and robotic work of their respective positions. She sits there in silence, he looks over his shoulder at the TV, and they only acknowledge each other when the conditions are met to do so. His glass was empty, and she fills it. There's times where they kiss, but in a way that's so obviously an act for Lain. They hold it in this odd, perfectly still stance, only breaking once Lain has been there for a few seconds. One detail I really love that's never explicitly called out is that they sleep in separate beds, which we can see here. It's not even a good act, it's just a bare bones production that anyone could see through. It just matters that it's there. From the indistinct figures dancing in Siberia to this robotic couple, the only bits which could constitute love that we see are just the shadow of it, either some pull to outright and blind pleasure or simply the utility of using someone else. There is no connection of romance or love in this world. This isn't something that seems to be a message of the anime, but rather the basis for what it's crafting. If the world was populated with happy couples and cute dates, it would be less believable that Lain would go to the extent she does to find connection. But when the world is full of this, it becomes easier to see. Whether we recognize it or not, we know it's a world where people aren't building relationships. It's a collection of small to moderate world-building notes that, at least to me, end up being critical to nailing the mood of the anime, one of its most unique and long-lasting selling points. But that's just romance. What about family and friends? Well, family is where the oddities of the anime really ramp up to 11. Some of my favorite scenes are essentially nothing happening. The first time Lain comes home from school, she's greeted by no one. In fact, you could say the only reason the anime happens is because of this. She went to the Na'vi because she wanted someone to talk to or interact with, and no one was there. So she thought maybe she had one of Chisa's emails, and she did. It's actually a constant world-building note that the Na'vi is the source of warmth in her home. We basically get this same scene again in episode 3, only with worse circumstances. Having just witnessed a murder-suicide up close, Lain is driven home by the police where she stares out the window at all the lit-up houses passing by. The only one which isn't is hers, where they drop her off without even a second thought. She enters and the house is painted in cold colors, entirely shades of blue without a hint of warmth. She explores the house in near silence, peering through cracked doors to no avail. The living room, the bedrooms, everywhere. It's a long sequence, and that is to stress an important detail. She takes a while and goes to the Na'vi last. It's not her first choice, it's what's left to her to desperately try and foster any kind of connection at all. She goes through the entire house slowly as if thinking, someone please come home, and then giving them all the time to do so. She sits at her desk, falls asleep, wakes up, looks around again, and still no one is there to greet her. She goes back to her room and we get the first hint of not warmth, but at least brightness, something that isn't pure loneliness, the screen of the Na'vi. And while there isn't any mail this time, the Na'vi itself is like a stand-in for conversation. It's commanded through speech and then reads the output back to you. Strikingly, and even drawing her attention, it says goodnight, something no one in her family is even there to do. Lain isn't drawn to the wire, she's forced to it by these cold conditions. The scene is exactly that, played out in full physicality, literally shown on the screen. The nothing is there for a reason, to make what follows feel impactful and reasonable. And even when her family is there, it's not like there's some bastion of connection to be found. Where episode 3's scene revels in the simplicity of its soundtrack's few notes, most of her family scenes relish the odd noises of the human race. When they sit down to eat, there's hardly any conversation, and we're instead met with the faint sounds of clinking and chewing, which only draws more attention and relatability to how empty this space is. We've all heard those sounds and had awkward moments around them and wished for it to stop. And then look at everything surrounding this. There's always too much food, and they live in a nice dated house, so it's not as if there's some obvious sign of tension between them all that breeds this silence. It's just simply there, infecting all of their interactions. Lain attempts to make conversation at times to break this, and there's actually some subtle evolution to the loneliness in those attempts as well. The first is telling her mother about Chisa's suicide rather bluntly, saying,
I got an email from a friend today. It was from this girl I know who killed herself last week.
There's not even a response to this, as we only see the same repeated animation that always accompanies her mother, which I'd like to think of as an Ono-style repetition of monotony, not just some budget-saving tact. But either way, later, after not just hearing about a suicide, but witnessing one, Lain doesn't even bother to try and break this silence with her mother because she's already said something just as awful and shocking and it led to nothing, so why try again? Just like her room grows crowded with technology, these scenes grow in her family's lack of care, building on each other and ensuring the proper mood. Her father is somewhat more involved and does serve as a mouthpiece for the series. Literally, during his most important point, we only see his mouth, but he is far from perfect either. There's an unspoken note about his character I love that adds to Lain's isolation even while surrounded, and that's that her father never really speaks to her in the first episodes, but more so at her. When he comes home in the first episode itself, he goes straight to his computer room to mess around with his machines rather than seeing how his own daughter is doing. When she comes down to see him, the conversation that ensues is plagued by long, drawn-out pauses, the clicks of his mouth, and the subtle whir of computer fans, once again an intentional highlight to make you notice how much space is between them and their words. And the words aren't really worth much. He's saying that you can live and communicate in both worlds, but while he's saying that, he's ignoring his daughter who never mentioned having such a fear. And she never comes closer than the doorway, just as he never comes closer to meet her. And in between them, one of my favorite uncalled out details in all of anime sits a literal wall of technology, and Lain only gets these slight glimpses of her father. He only gets slight glimpses of her, but isn't even looking as the camera pans over it all, and it's so beautiful. All of their interactions have this wall between them. That's why it's here in their first scene together. He doesn't really show an interest in her, but an interest in her being interested in the things that he's interested in. It's just her meeting at what separates them. It's not an actual connection. Fitting, given that she's able to turn her room into a den of technology under his nose. How is a parent shocked at the state of their kid's room like this? How long had it been since he was up there, since he checked on his daughter? How did it happen without him noticing? He really wasn't home to receive any of those packages, but we know he wasn't, and we know because Lain receives one herself like she probably does every single time, with strange men coming to the door and no one being around to make sure she's safe. It's another moment that, while it may seem random, serves a much greater purpose. Where her father is right there, but with a wall in between, her friends are usually seen at a distance. Like peering through the cracked doors at home, here she generally watches from afar until she's somehow called into the conversation, where they mostly speak around her and how behind she is. My favorite mark of this distance is in episode 2, right here. There's no need for this added motion, but it signifies the camera is moving a large distance, much more than what's actually in between them. It's saying that even if they're close, they're not close. She's not one of this group, she's just tolerated by a couple of them for Alice, and even Alice's language sounds more like toleration than anything else. Her word choice is all about someone else inside Lain who's more fun, how she's stuck in a shell, and oftentimes she doesn't even wait for Lain to give a response, but assumes what she must have wanted to say anyway. It's a dizzying array of these three asking her something, taking her reaction to mean it must be false, then flipping somehow to true to end somewhere in between with no progress made. Again, in episode 2, there's a series of quick cuts between the trio, which may seem like nothing, but it makes us more like Lain. In a rapid succession, they all look at us directly and dictate these thoughts, like what we would see from Lain's point of view. It's a small production detail to help invoke these same feelings as her, watching with no control over the situation, being talked at, being looked at or briefly passed, but not really seen or heard. Surrounded, but alone. All of this together makes it perfectly clear why she turns to the Wired, but the Wired is a mess of nonsense where we never see her actually confirmed interacting with someone else. She's shouting at her Navi while we hear other voices, or yelling at abstract human forms with no defining features, or laughing with some liminal space where we can't interpret what the other side is saying and it's just nonsense. When God speaks to her, it's from above or through an amorphous form, at least to begin with. And when it's not what may be a conversation, it's an absolute nightmare of nonsense, often spewing adult or outright sexual topics at her. I adore the scenes of wired nonsense where abstract imagery or meaningless code play out before us, because again, there's no connection here. There's a lot of things, a lot of stuff, a stark contrast to the static and silent moments around them, but that doesn't somehow make connection happen. It's just because there's so much instead of silence, we get an overwhelming flow of information, some of which describes episodes later, some of which means nothing, and the rest who can say? I think the most striking is when she's digging for information and comes to this page. She's here for information, it's information she gets, and who can blame her? Would you want to stick around on that page? As her father says, the Wired is a tool, but there's no guarantee that a tool is going to be effective or even used for the right things. I did years of stage crew, and I'll tell you, everything is a hammer if you try hard enough. All we know about tools is that they're there and that they can be used for something. Slowly, the lack of connection is turned into potential for it. The silence is broken by sound, but it's random and jumbled. The static frames are replaced by nonsensical animation. The space between her and others has lessened, but now there's no form to those surrounding her. They all speak about a her that she doesn't know. It leads to her eventual isolation and removal of herself from the world, all built on this initial platform of how the anime makes us feel it through its lack of connections, with all these small details and careful imagery and sound design. I'm sure there's a term for this, but I'm just making things up as I go, so I call it productive nothing. It's things that may seem cheap, but are actually very carefully crafted. It's like the metal speech in Black Lagoon. It's very static and silent, not because of limitation or laziness or bad direction, but because there's something to be focused on. The tension between Rock and Ravi, the harshness of her words in the space where they're physically forced together. The clinging of the metals rings out clear to mark her point as she says it. Anything else would simply distract from the reasoning that all of this is happening. It's the same thing with Serial Experiments Lain. These moments are meant to be uncomfortably silent and awkward. You're supposed to be annoyed with the subtle lip smacking of her family's dinner time. Her mother is supposed to feel robotic and repetitious with her reused animation. That constant humming sound, it's a reminder that electricity and technology is there permeating through the entire world more and more as Lain advances. Would it be harder and more time consuming and thus maybe seem more valuable to carefully score every single scene? Yes, but there's something in the restraint to not do so that can enhance things. Just because it can be done doesn't mean it should be. Lain is a product of its time, the boom of the technological age, the aesthetic that went with it, the limitations of animation they worked with and not around. It's an anime that could only have been made when it was. And in that way, I've respected in what it did. My preference is for stories to have a defined message, but defined or not, there needs to be a basis for what people are going to be told to think about within it. And not many things have ever built a better basis for that than Serial Experiments Lain does. And I think that is a big reason why an anime that is so purposefully obtuse and obscure can remain so popular even 20 years later, 20 plus years later at this point. But I think I've pretty much rambled on about everything I needed to. This video is probably the most I've ever seen like that Charlie Day meme, pointing at the wall being real crazy. But I think it turned out good. This is something I've really been trying to kind of pin down and express for a while, so I'm happy I was able to at least get it out in some semblance here today. Naturally, I'd love to hear what you think as well, not just because it really does help the channel out with the algorithm, but because I'm just a novice on the internet, like I said earlier. I'm making things up as I go along, and I'd love to see what you guys have noticed in not just Lain, but other anime as well, like how we mentioned the same kind of concept in Black Lagoon here. So I'm not cutting that out. This was almost perfect, as always. Let me know what you thought as well. There's some important links in the pinned comment, Twitter, Discord, Twitch, but most importantly, Patreon, where the people above me are supporting me directly and being super awesome, and you can get your name up there too if you do the same. But anyway, thank you for watching, and I hope I'll see you again soon.